Ladies and gentlemen, law and regulation do exist everywhere, regardless of the variations in the way of implementations from place to another. In some areas, a human dies because of water, whereas in other places, distinguished innovation are launched to reach quality, efficiency, security, and most important, the sustainability of water resources. Our guests today have outstanding, dynamic alternatives to, let's say, suggested that lead to the main aims of this session. Let's move now from the current situation of the law regulating water to how can we strengthen the legal framework to protect the human health and environment through the control of protecting underground water and using it. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome my speakers for today, Ms. Christina Maugüé and Dr. Jacques Sironneau, well known to all of you, and Ms. Mouton, and Professor Bernard Poujade. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Christine Maugüé, and I'm a member of the French Conseil d'État. The French Conseil d'État has a double role. It's both the French Supreme Administrative Court, in charge of settling cases in the field of administrative law, and a legal advisor to the government. And in addition to this role as counselor, the Conseil d'État makes studies, drafts, and reports on current issues. And 4 years ago, the Conseil d'État made a study about water regulation in France. So I'm very glad to participate in that workshop. And I'll be discussing how we can strengthen the legal framework to protect the quality of groundwater and to control the use of groundwater. So I'll be covering 3 topics. What are the uses of groundwater in Abu Dhabi? What are the different ways to protect groundwater from contamination and to control the use of groundwater? And then, how does the Abu Dhabi Water Framework apply that suggestions? So, first topic, what are the uses of groundwater in Abu Dhabi? I will go quickly because we have already heard about this, but just to remember, first of all, groundwater and seawater are the principal natural water resources of Abu Dhabi, and rainfall is a negligible resource, except in the eastern plains, below the Omani Mountains. Second point, the main source of water in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi is derived from pumping groundwater. Pumped groundwater makes up approximately 80% of the total water resources used in the Emirate. Third point, pumped groundwater is used essentially for agriculture, forestry, and public amenities or landscape maintaining. Fourth point, water uses for agriculture, forestry, and public amenities has grown rapidly since desert greening and agricultural food self-sufficiency policies were introduced since in the 1960s. Fifth point, groundwater is most of the time brackish, either moderately or highly, and the volume of French groundwater reserves is very low. Moderately brackish groundwater resources are used on many commercial plants and trees, but highly brackish water can only be used on a restricted range of plants and trees, for instance, broad grass. And at least decline of water quality is a problem, as groundwater salinity continues to increase. So the number of crops which can be grown in high salinities is reduced, and the yields are declining. So my second topic is to have a view on the different ways or different methods to protect groundwater from contamination and to control the use of groundwater. Preserving groundwater quality is critical for food production and for healthcare. So it's necessary to avoid a potential healthcare crisis caused by the consumption of unsafe water. But it should be noticed that there is no international framework for water regulation. International environment law includes agreements amongst different nations, such as treaties, principles, and rules that are binding on the area concerned and the states in their relation with other states. But there is no international treaty or agreement about water regulation. There are only bilateral treaties. The multilateral treaties are very few. I've found one example, the 1997 United Nations Water Courses Convention. It's a convention on the law of the non-navigational uses of international water courses. But there is a soft environmental law which has no binding effect in itself, but offers guidelines that help in the shaping of environmental policy. World Health Organization guidelines, and I will come back to that point. However, different ways can be used by a country to protect groundwater quality, to preserve this scarce resource, and environmental protection policy can use these ways together or separate. First of all, quality control of groundwater. The control of groundwater is essential in order to protect public health and has to be effective. So there are methods of assessing water quality. Analysis of water, which shows the chemical markers of groundwater, that's determining its potential use. Analysis of the salinity of water. And the extent of groundwater contamination determines its use. Domestic and agricultural groundwater uses require separate standards. There are no international standards to determine if groundwater is contaminated or not, but guidelines of the World Health Organization. There are two kinds of guidelines from the World Health Organization. Guidelines for drinking water quality. The guidelines give standards and quality check process for drinking water. And there are guidelines for the safe use of wastewater, excreta, and grey water when used in agriculture. These guidelines do not intend to be mandatory limits, but they provide a scientific point of departure for development of national or regional numerical drinking water quality standards. No single approach is universally applicable, and the nature and form of drinking water standards may vary among countries and regions. So each country has to set its own standards, emission standards in water and water quality standards, and these standards have to be upheld. And this is the responsibility of each country to control that these environmental standards are upheld. Second way, it's the control of groundwater use. Because groundwater is not a free resource, its use must be controlled. And there are different ways to control the groundwater use. And for example, a licensing and permitting system for wells can be created so that the owners who wish to dig a new well or to expand or add a larger pump are required to apply for a license which gives permission and set a maximum abstraction rate and permitting activity. Third way, it's the identification of key areas with greater protection. A number of human activities also contribute to the chemical status of the groundwater. And water resources can be managed in a non-universal manner. It means that different degrees of regulation and control can be applied. For instance, important groundwater recharge areas can be defined so that in that areas the activities are limited, more limited than in other areas. Fourth way, it's the optimization of the use of groundwater. Water use must be adapted in relation to the quality of water. Groundwater currently accounts for a very small portion of domestic water supplies in Abu Dhabi as a result of declining water quality and increased pumping costs. More agricultural best practices can be suggested. It means the introduction of crops and irrigation practices which more readily optimize efficient water use instead of having a high rate of agricultural water use. Fifth way, water treatment solutions. There is a need for additional treatment when the quality of water is too low. For example, desalination is used to remove salts from brackish water to render the water acceptable for human consumption or for other uses. Sixth way, it's the use of fiscal instruments, including taxation of pollution. So the principle of polluter pays, or extended producer responsibility, stresses the fact that the polluter should pay for any cost that arise from harmful treatment of the environment. And finally, the restricted use of groundwater. It's the ability to restrict the use of groundwater in certain circumstances. For example, when groundwater is contaminated, the license given for a well can be revoked or suspended. Let's come now to the Abu Dhabi Water Framework and see how does this framework apply these suggestions. So, there is a successful Abu Dhabi framework for produced water management. There are water quality regulations in Abu Dhabi, fourth edition in January 2014. They focus on the drinking water quality. These regulations have been produced with this primary aim, the assurance of safe and efficient drinking water supplies to consumers. So, these regulations apply to any person who delivers water to or conveys water through pipelines or delivers water by road vehicle for the purposes of drinking, washing, cooking, or food production. There is a regulation and supervision bureau which is established in Abu Dhabi to oversee the economic and technical activities of the water, wastewater, and electricity companies that are licensed to operate in the Emirate, and the Bureau may at any time modify or revoke an authorization whether or not it's expressly given for a specific period, revoke any approval given or modify any such approval by including conditions or varying existing conditions. Usually, the Bureau must give to the supplier 6 months, except in any case in which the Bureau is of the opinion that the immediate revocation, modification, or prohibition is necessary in the interest of public health. There are 2 recycled water and biosolids regulations since 2010. They provide a framework for appropriate and consistent wastewater flow monitoring practices for the wastewater sector in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. But it should be noticed that there is not the same level of water regulation for pumped groundwater. These regulations do not have an equivalent for pumped groundwater. Second point, specific environmental standards need to be established for Abu Dhabi. There is still a need for appropriate standards for the environmental conditions of Abu Dhabi. Most of the various environmental standards being used in Abu Dhabi today are based on those already defined by organizations such as the World Health Organization or the Australian government. But so therefore, there is a need for an increased knowledge of physical and chemical status of water, for the setting of specific standards, specific data, to ensure that the environment is indeed protected, and at least for a periodic review and revision of standards. Third point, there is a need for substantive measures for protecting groundwater depletion and pollution control of groundwater. Since 2005, groundwater management is one of the main activities assigned to the newly formed Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi. And the need for an increased control of groundwater has been recognized, and as a major step towards controlling groundwater development, a water well drilling law was issued in March 2006, which authorized the licensing and drilling of water wells. So a licensing and permitting system for wells has been set on in March 2006. It's law number 6, which has brought groundwater use under greater control. All drilling contractors working in Abu Dhabi Emirate are required to have a valid drilling license issued by the Environment Agency. And the well permitting policy is managed by the agency, which grants groundwater wells, contractor registration, and licenses in Abu Dhabi. But there is a lack of effectiveness, and there must be controls to assure that groundwater is not pumped without authorization. And there is still a need for increased enforcement of current and future regulations. For instance, the zoning of environmental regulations and laws in sensitive areas has been explored very little today in Abu Dhabi. Regulation of land use in sensitive areas should be developed, and the establishment of groundwater management areas has been undertaken in many countries to give protection to important aquifers and to reduce the cost of cleaning water that has been polluted by human activities. So, and at least there is also a need to establish a water law that considers all sources of water within the same framework. Currently, groundwater is viewed as a separate resource and not as a component of the overall water resources available. And the split between natural and produced water management is a problem for the development of a coherent water policy and laws. And there are 3 types of distributed water: desalinated water, recycled water, and groundwater, but there is no global strategy. And only an agency with overall water resources management responsibilities will be capable of assessing issues and enforcing such a legal framework, And the future strategy for improved water management in Abu Dhabi has to gradually shift from supply management to demand management in the context of integrated water resources management, where water conservation becomes the key issue in all water use sectors. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I thank my dear colleague, Anthony Chamboredon, for his invitation at this summit about water. And also, I'm glad to see in the audience and among the moderators our brilliant students from Paris Sorbonne University, Abu Dhabi. So we are proud. Also, I admire the capacity of premonition of Anthony Chamboredon, because at the beginning of the summit, the rain was there in Abu Dhabi. So it's a fantastic capacity of premonition, dear Anthony. But I have an explanation, because my wife was in Abu Dhabi on Monday, and when she is in a country, the rain appears. So even in Mauritania, and when she is in a country, rain is there. So most seriously, I heard a lot of things very interesting, and particularly all the speakers, of course. Our colleague Piotr was very impressive, because the Bible reference to institutes of the Justinian Code, I'm impressed. So I must prove that the French lawyer know also the ancient Greece and the Roman world, and beginning with to show the importance of this subject, water, the illustration of a famous verse of a Greek poet of ancient Greece, Pindar, Ariston Menudor, is ancient Greek. The translation may be the first of goods is water. And he was, this verse was in an ode, an Olympian ode, placing so the water, the value of water for the human being before the value of gold. So it's impressive. But this ode was in honor of a champion of an horse race. So I know that it's very important in Abu Dhabi also. So it's the choice is maybe it could be good. First of goods is water, yes, and it's called blue gold. Somebody uses this formula. More seriously, the reason of this invitation, I'm not a distinguished expert of water. I make some lectures in Paris Sorbonne University, Abu Dhabi, on environmental law, and particularly in French environmental law. I was very interested a few years ago in the juridical aspects of the French public bodies, and Anthony Chamboredon asked me to talk about this, the water agency. It's the name now. Formerly, it was the Basing Financial Agencies. These French public bodies, and I wrote some articles on the fees of the water agencies and the difficulty to identify them on the legal point of view in our French classification of taxes. And finally, I participate, I was a poor lawyer among distinguished economists. I was alone. I was the only one lawyer, the only lawyer lost among prestigious economists in the General Commission for Planning in 1997, which made a report on the evaluation of the French technique of water agencies. So my short presentation, 10 minutes, is only juridical, of course. Mr. Sironneau, who is a very, very prestigious expert in France, head of the unit on water at the French Ministry for Environment, said that it's the law of 1964 was the first law, this is the first law, and it was the 50th birthday in December last year, and this law created the Water Basin Agency. And I must use an opinion from somebody I care, of course, because it was my father, who was the first French Minister for Environment in France and creating the Ministry of Environment. And he said in his memory that this law was interesting. It was interesting to notice that this law is the first one showing a modern approach of environmental problems at ecological, economical, and financial level. Yes, that's right. According to a lot of experts, this system of water agencies nowadays still a model exported in a lot of countries. Mr. Sironneau made a presentation, and even now Vietnam in 2012, if I see on the board. And last year at the conference in Paris, the deputy head of unit at the European Commission, Nicolas Notaro, said that the integrated French approach for water management represented a technique ahead of its time. He used the words, "this French know-how," which spread out since the adoption of the law of 1964. And he said that this technique used in France for 50 years is still valid, and we try to promote at the level of the European Union and also at the international level the system of water integrated management at basin level. And this technique is integrated in the Water Framework Directive of 2000. So there is a model, a French model of water agency, obviously modern because it's the early application of several principles which appeared later in our national and international law. I'm a public lawyer, but not in international law like our colleague from Poland. But these principles appeared later in international and national environmental law, Conference of Stockholm, Rio, and etc., etc. In our Charter for Environment, you know that there is an Article 7 providing public policies shall promote sustainable development. This is an example. This is an example of the application a lot of time before the adoption of our Charter for Environment, this principle of promoting sustainable development. These 6 French water agencies, I'm not talking about our overseas territories, of course, are public bodies working to promote sustainable development for the state, and you have seen the map with Mr. Sironneau. So the water resources are managed in an integrated manner in river basin districts. That's the originality of the creation of the water agencies. Original because we don't use our traditional way of managing. You said this morning that the French administration, you have a division, department, region, but it was very original to avoid this scheme and to choose another. It's basin district. It's very different, of course. So this is a new management, this technique of a river basin district delineated by dividing lines of the surface water. So the basin system is very interesting. What are the targets of the water agencies? The target maybe is to contribute to achieve the objectives of the good water status in the French basins. And the targets are several. First of all, reducing pollutant discharges from all sources, granting the quality of the water supplied, fostering the sustainable development of the economic activities that use water, and also protecting, rehabilitating aquatic environments and wetlands, and also regulating flows, natural flood areas, and river maintenance, furthering urban and rural solidarity with respect to wastewater treatment and drinking water. And also, there is a goal of solidarity and international cooperation. For example, you know that one of the water agency made a cooperation with the Palestinian Water Authority, for example. I take this example in 2011. And also, there is another target, which is informing the general public and raising the awareness of the public and of the school children about managing and sustainably protecting water and the aquatic environments. So the water agencies implement also the objectives and the provision of our different planning. It's an obsession of the French, the planning techniques. We talked this morning on binding and non-binding techniques. So the planning is a characteristic of the French administration. So the water agencies implement the objectives and provision of the water development and management master plans, which are plans inspired or based on the Water Framework Directive of the European Union, of course. How? By fostering well-balanced, efficient management of water and of the aquatic environment, the drinking water supply, the flow regulation, and the sustainable development of economic activities. So the activity of the water agency are organized around the principle of concerted management of river basin district. So this is not decentralization or deconcentration, like we said, because Mr. Sironneau said, of course, he's from the French ministry. It's public bodies under the control of the state, of the Ministry of Environment. But also, there is a part of decentralization. I shall prove it in a few minutes. Concerted management, I said, and the water agencies fulfill their duties within a framework of action programs with the objective of achieving good water status, which is the goal of the Water Framework Directive. What is interesting is to relate the action of the water agencies with the natural principle of environment. And the water agencies implement a lot of environmental principles, like, of course, the principle of participation. You know that this principle aims to make responsible, to involve economic agents, citizens, of course, concerning the realization of environmental measures. Thus, it seeks to improve the content of projects and facilitate the application by involving the most possible number of concerned actors. It's the application of the Aarhus Convention, of course, and this convention provides in particular the rules of public participation in decisions about activities, plans, programs, policies regarding the environment and the elaboration of normative provisions. So this principle can be implemented in various ways. Participation of association, for example, in advisory bodies, participation of association in elaboration of planning documents or schemes, public inquiries. But the water agency is an example of this participation, because in this body, the composition of the administration council, you are in the council, you have representative of regions, of local authorities, which are in France, municipalities, departments, and what we call groupings. Right? public bodies of cooperation between municipalities, which are locating in the basin, but also representative of users, consumers, association for the protection of nature, for fishing, and of course of competent person, representative appointed by the state, and in particular from social professional groups. So there is this participation inside, and they need to try to elaborate a consensus on the program and the action. And there is also a coordination with the state. Of course, Mr. Sironneau talked about the prefect of the region, where the water agency has headquarters, and his role, of course, is very important. So the strategy of the French water agency is to achieve good water status, with which is the objective set by the directive, the European directive, of course. This water development and management master plans I talked a few minutes ago are prepared and validated by the stakeholders in the water sector within the main orientation of national and European water policies, and that's to say basin committees, fostering debate and local consensus building in the spirit of what we call the French Grenelle environment policy, which is another illustration of the principle of participation. The mission of the water agencies is integrated into the strategy of the water development and management master plans. So for each river basin district, the basic orientation for well-balanced management of the water resources and the water quantity and quality targets. So it's constitute, of course, the objective of this water development and management master plans constitute a French commitment to the European authorities, of course. Illustration, I finished on this illustration also of the application of the user-pays principle, the polluter pays principle. Yes, of course. We talk about taxes. Well, there is maybe a difficulty because the name of different types of ecological taxation can be misleading. And this is an example because we call this fees of water agencies. But in fact, it's taxes. It's taxes from the legal point of view, the French legal point of view. This tax character was highlighted by the State Council, le Conseil d'État. You were not in this case? No, okay. This is the reason why since 2006, since a new law, these fees are placed under the approval and the control of course, of the Parliament. But the Council of Administration can fix the amount of the fees in a limit fixed by the Parliament. These fees are, of course, an illustration of the polluter pays principle, because you know, it's according to it, the cost arising from measure to prevent, reduce, or combat pollution must be borne by the polluter. And now you know that our President Chirac decided to elaborate a charter for environment, and now you have an Article 4 saying that all persons must contribute to repair the damage that they cause to the environment under the condition defined by law. And the fees are an application of the principle of prevention and the principle of repairing damage to environment, and are pooled on the basis of basin solidarity. What is interesting that the fees are paid even by residential users, by domestic, by individuals, but also by companies, of course. And thanks to these fees, the water agencies can then provide financial support within the framework of their intervention program, subsidies and loans, both to public entities or private individuals to carry out river basin action or projects for the common good, with the goal of achieving the balanced management of water resources. And I can give you some indication about the intervention program. Yes, I am finishing. The 55% treatment of urban household wastewater, 8% drinking water supply, 6% implementing policies, 5% fighting industrial pollution, 10 restoring the quality of aquatic environment, 6 fighting agricultural pollution, and 6 quantitative management of the resource. So, in conclusion, I'm not sure that the presentation of this French model can be an article of export for Abu Dhabi, because that is a question. So I'm not sure that my speech is very holistic, and I'm not sure that it is a relevant experience for Abu Dhabi. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bernard Poujade. Thank you very much. Well, I will invite Dr. Jacques Sironneau. Floor is yours.
So for the participants who were not present for the first presentation, I'm Jacques Sironneau from the French Ministry of Environment. And so we'll start directly from the point 4. What about water legal and institutional in Abu Dhabi? And we'll end with some proposals. So just to, the first point is related to the water resources management for the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. I think this document, this strategical document, it's my opinion, proposes a very accurate and relevant diagnosis related to resources availability and demand within a context of high water scarcity. It implies to minimize the abstraction, notably from fossil aquifers, and it can therefore be seen a very huge demand for irrigation and forestry, 76%, and of course the growing one for household uses, whilst at the same time the impacts of desalination and recycled water discharges on terrestrial and marine ecosystem are minimized. The above mentioned strategy contains also a very clear awareness that a balance has to be made between the economical development and the environmental sustainability, which imply well-balanced water management, reconciling both the economical and ecological uses, and of course making them compatible with each other. It contains also a very pragmatic institutional approach, for example, including the Water Council for the official coordination and a working group for the informal one. It contains a water planning for an optimum water management, and which is the Abu Dhabi Water Resources Master Plan. And at last, it contains a clear and objective analysis for the existing gaps. And what about now about the current legal and institutional water framework in Abu Dhabi? There are two main laws. The first one is the law 1999 related to protection of environment, and which defines a very important topic, which is water environment. as both marine environment and inland water, which is a quite fair definition, because the coastal marine waters constitute at the time the natural outlet of the natural pollution and is a particularly rich aquatic ecosystem where you meet various economical uses such as fishing, bathing, and so on. The second law is the law number 2, regulation on the water and electricity, amended several times, and which may ensure the continuable availability of potable water on the Abu Dhabi Water and Electricity Authority. If you add to that a lot of more technical regulation, which are mostly focused on pollution or drinking water supply. This, I think, if you consider both strategy, we were talking about a few minutes ago, and the study of those various laws, I think there are three main gaps in this system. First, the water laws and the technical orders are, it's also a strength, but it's mostly, according to me, a weakness. They are mainly focused on wastewater and drinking water supply. So, it lacks a legal status of an integrated water resources management for raw water. Water you may find mostly either in the sea or in the fossil aquifers, and also a lack of incentives for example to dissuade from over consumption and polluted discharges. And I may complete the question which was answered to me a few minutes ago during the first presentation about the leakages. So it could be possible to enforce incentives, for example, to help the managers of the drinking water supply networks to repair their networks. It could be, it wouldn't be a punishment. It could be an incentive. So to help them, to grant them some loans or subsidies to repair and their pipes. So this was from the legal point of view. The second, so those were the gaps. I am late with the PowerPoint presentation, and we have also to say a few words about the main current institution related to water. I have to confess there are a lot of them. You have the Permanent Committee for Setting and Implementing Water and Agricultural Strategies, the Abu Dhabi Food Control Authority, the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi, the ADWA, the Abu Dhabi Water and Electricity Authority, and so on, the Regulation and Supervision Bureau, RSB, and so on. So, if you add institutional description to legal description, what could be done? What has to be strengthened? So firstly, some legal issues have to be solved. From my point of view, it would be necessary to enforce a law. I repeat my obsession. It would be necessary to enforce a law setting a legal status for water as a common good or common patrimony. It's not a property. It's a patrimony whose preservation is of general interest. The second point would be to define and affirm the notion of an overall and well-balanced water management, which is a key notion, because it's very simple. Just add a provision as the first article of a law, which would including an overall water management. All kinds of water, all types of installation, works, facilities concern quality as well as quantity issues. A well-balanced water management establishing both the balance between resource and aquatic environment and the balance between the various uses. It's not sustainable to have a huge consumption, for example, for agriculture, and which deters other users to have a fair use. You have to foresee also, Abu Dhabi has to foresee an integrated water resources management plan, which is the consequence of this definition. You have to establish an operational commission, which is a technical commission composed of representatives from the various official public entities involved into the water policy, which is in fact the institutionalization of the current existing group, working group. You will have probably, it would be interesting. My colleague told that a few minutes ago, to disconnect water and from electricity. Make a clear distinction between water policy and operation. I mean, between water police more than policy, which is water police is the control and the permits and so on, and which has to be distinguished from the operation, facilities and so on. Establish further national water agency, which would gather the various competencies in the field of water coming from the various existing agencies into a supervising and coordinating entity independent from each category of users. And also, Professor Poujade insisted, involve representative of the main categories of users in the water management. And if you want, some more issues are to be solved. If you want to perfect the system, the first point would be to determine how to protect the quality of groundwater, to control its use for preserving both the human health and the environment, including groundwater into an overall provision, which was to, and defining a legal status for all those waters, and mostly for fossil groundwaters, which are the main water resources in Abu Dhabi with the sea. Setting minimum standards of contamination, for example, prohibition of groundwater use for producing drinking water if it contains some nitrates more than 50 milligrams per liter, for example. It's a standard enforced by the European Community. And at last, see how to balance the uses between the three main categories of users, through the inventory of the main groundwater bodies. I think it's on now. The allocation of a percentage of each water body to each category of users, and the limitation of permits issuances within the strict frame of this allocation, and through the establishment of tariffs for groundwater, taxes. You can name that taxes, fees, or tariffs. So you have a way. I think it's necessary to pay some fees according to the seasonal availability, the quality of the groundwater resources, and for non-diffuse discharges coming from farming, which are hugely likely to jeopardize the terrestrial and marine ecosystems, and all that based on the quantity of pollutant discharge. And just at the last one, the last one is a system in France to protect the places where we have abstraction of water for producing water drinking supply. We have four different perimeters of protection or zones. The first one, which is where we are very strict standards. It has to be bought by the municipality, and it has to be put under a fence. And the second, and the closer, the stricter, and it works for 40 years now. And we added a fourth one, which is the larger, the wider perimeter. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for all your recommendation and solution that you proposed. Let me, gentlemen, invite Mita Mouton to talk about the legal options would be available to apply the efficient tariffs on the 3 types of distillated water.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chambon-Redon, for enabling me to be here. So my name is Mathilde Mouton, and I work for a French consulting firm which is called Espelia, and which is specialized in advising public bodies in the management of their public services and utilities in the water sector, but also in waste management, energy, transport, etc. So as it was presented by my colleagues earlier on, the expansion of water supply capacities in oil-rich countries over the past decades was mostly financed by cross-subsidies with very low tariffs. However, as shown by the recent adoption of a new tariff structure by Abu Dhabi on the 1st of January of this year, there has been increasing acceptation in the past few years for the water pays for water principle, which means that the water sector should generate its own income. And this is mostly due to 2 types of concerns. Environmental concerns on the first hand, with increasing water scarcity, pollution of natural ecosystems calling for stronger water demand management, and economic concerns on the second hand, with growing supply costs due to all the reasons that Laura Parmigiani listed earlier on, calling for greater cost recovery. So based on these observations, my presentation will aim at presenting the different types of instruments used in water pricing policies, as well as the legal principles guiding the establishment of these policies. And what I will try to question through this presentation is to what extent can these measures actually promote water sector environmental, social, as well as financial sustainability, especially, obviously, in arid countries. Now, before going into the details of water pricing instruments and legal principles, I'd just like to stop on the definition of water cost. Water costs do not only include the cost of supply, meaning capital charges, as well as operation and maintenance costs of utilities, but also the opportunity cost of producing water, as well, and this is very important, as economic and environmental externalities, negative externalities, obviously, due to water consumption and water use rejection. Now, what are the principles guiding cost recovery and water pricing policies? They've already been presented by my colleagues. I will try to show examples of how these principles can actually be implemented. The user pays principle on the first hand, according to which tariffs should be set according to water use and consumption, so that consumers actually pay for the service that is delivered to them in proportion to what they consume. And the polluter pays principle on the second hand, which states that tariffs should be set in order to internalize negative externalities due to water consumption. So water pricing policies often result from the combination of these principles, depending on the costs that one is trying to recover, as well as on the signals it wishes to send to consumers. The user pays principle, on the first hand, is often used to recover the cost of public supply through consumption-based tariffs. Consumption-based tariffs are usually set by public water suppliers or by national regulators and applied to all users of the public utilities operated by the supplier. They usually result from the combination of a fixed charge, also called flat fee, which is used in order to reduce the risk taken by the operator, as well as a variable fee, meaning a price per liter or cubic meter, which is why the final amount of the water bill varies depending on the consumption of the consumer. So how can these tariffs be designed in order to encourage more responsible use and to allocate resources in an efficient and equitable way? Well, in order to encourage responsible use, the simple fact that the tariff structure includes a variable fee constitutes an incentive. Now, water authorities wishing to increase this incentive can design the tariff structure according to what we call increasing block tariffs. What are increasing block tariffs? They are a range of increasing unit prices set for 2 or more pre-specified consumption blocks, meaning that the more the consumption rises, the more the price per cubic meter increases. This enables water authorities to charge excessive consumptions, or what is considered as an excessive consumption, depending on consumption patterns and on needs, obviously, above cost rate, marginal cost rate, whilst low consumption or vital consumption, which has to be defined, legally defined, obviously, can be charged below cost rate. So the number and the threshold of the blocks can be set at the national level according, as I said, to consumption patterns, and must also take into account price elasticity of water users. So as you can see, the design of such a tariff structure interferes with both legal and economical issues and decisions. Here on the graph you have there on the right, is the tariff structure applied by the SONED, which is the national Tunisian water supplier in Tunisia for residential and industrial uses. As you can see, it is designed according to 7 increasing blocks, targeting different categories of consumers. And the threshold of the blocks were determined after analyzing consumption patterns of these different consumers and obviously price elasticity of these usages. So before going into this slide, one could think that these increasing block tariffs or that these tariff structures should be applied uniformly to all consumers in order to maintain equality between consumers. As a matter of fact, in French law, there is a principle that says that users having access to the same service quality should be treated equally. But equality doesn't necessarily mean efficiency, nor equity or fairness. So there are a few derogations, exceptions to this principle, even in French law, in order to allocate resources in an efficient and fair way. For example, in many OECD countries, different tariffs can be applied to different categories of users, such as farmers, industries, and domestic users, domestic households. These are the three categories that you will find in most OECD countries, depending on the added value of a cubic meter for each of these usages. So here on the right, as you can see, you have a graph which compares agricultural, industrial, and household water prices in several European countries in the late 90s. As you can see, the price per cubic meter applied to farmers in the agricultural sector, it's in blue, is often much lower than the one applied to domestic users. This results from a political choice to allocate sufficient and affordable amounts of water resources to farmers. To finish with water tariff differentiation, tariffs can also be differentiated depending on social criteria. Currently in France, there is an experimentation going on for the implementation of social tariffs. This is often used to ensure affordable access to all, and also to offset the impact of increasing block tariffs on poor and numerous families. These tariffs can be implemented through, for example, different rates or different threshold applied to the blocks depending on criteria such as family size or household incomes. So this is for the user pays principle, which is, as I said, used to recover the cost of supply. Now, if you refer to the slide I presented earlier on, recovering the cost of supply isn't sufficient to recover the full cost of water. So in order to recover the environmental cost of water pumping as well as sewage discharge, countries usually refer to the polluter pays principle, which mostly concerns, but not only, and I will come back to it, non-public water users, meaning farmers or industrials that aren't connected to the public network, that pump water directly from water aquifers or discharge water, used water, directly into watercourses. And this polluter pays principle can be implemented through abstraction licenses, which can vary depending on the type of resource or on the usage or on the amount of water which is pumped from water aquifers, as well as pollution charges, which can then vary depending on the type of effluent, especially in the industrial sector, the type of recipient body, as well as the quantity of water discharge. So I said that these charges was mostly concerned non-public water users. As my colleagues mentioned, they can also be applied to public water users through, for example, additional fees or additional charges applied on water bills, such as the taxes that the water agencies apply in France and which they then use to finance investments in the environmental or sector or for the renewal of water utilities. So fees can be collected depending on the governance system, either at the local, regional, or national level, and then used to finance investments in the environmental sector, for example, but also in the expansion of water utilities, investments that benefit to all. And above all, such charges are used to regulate the allocation of water resources between users. For example, high abstraction licenses on pumping in water aquifers might discourage farmers to pump directly from water aquifers and encourage them to connect to the public network, which supplies other resources. Likewise, high pollution charges might discourage industrials to discharge used water directly into watercourses and encourage them to turn to water reuse, for example. Now, to conclude, on the right you have a graph which summarizes the different instruments that I presented. As you can see, the design of an integrated water pricing policy requires that costs be identified at all levels. And this is especially true in a country like Abu Dhabi, where you have different types of resources and different types of authorities regulating each one of these resources. And recovered according to objectives such as social equity, environmental protection, etc., which must be set and directed at the national level. So integrated water pricing policy must therefore be designed in collaboration with all public or even private entities in water management at all levels, and must therefore be supported by a strong governance system. And finally, and it will be my last concluding remark, I'd just like to stress the fact, because I've concentrated on water pricing, that water pricing is only one instrument of broader water demand management policies, and that to be efficient, pricing measures must be integrated into more complete water demand management policies, acting and targeting all levels of water demand. That can be done through technical improvements in service quality, renewal of public networks in order to reduce water leakages, replacement of household appliances with low water consuming equipment, etc. Law enforcement, obviously, we've talked about this a lot today, fighting against illegal connections, delivery and control of water abstraction permits, quotas, etc. As well, and this is probably the most important measure actually, communication measures and awareness programs over environmental issues, service quality, and financial sustainability of water utilities. I think an efficient water pricing policy cannot be implemented if people aren't aware of why they are paying what they consume, basically. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I will go to the audience question. Please.
Okay, I'm from Korea. I'm catching about the water price, and you talk about the water price in the agricultural, in household, industry. So I'm thinking about the drinking water is a human right, and it's the most important thing for the all humankind. So what's your opinion of the water price for drinking water in the future?
Huge. A huge
Broad
program.
question. No, well, first I think it has to be defined legally, which is why I think the topic of this session is very important. As I mentioned, the water pays for water principle is something that's encoded in the French law. And then I think what is important to explain to people is that they're not actually paying for water. They're paying for water supply and for potable water supply. And this is different because it requires investments in capital, in operation, maintenance, etc. It has a cost. So that's what should be explained to people, that water supply has a cost and that water consumption, if it is excessive or mismanaged, can also have a cost on the environment, which has to be internalized if we want to be in a sustainable system. But maybe someone else would like to add something.
Yes, please.
I have one remark which I would like to add up with a question I'd like to direct to Mr. Sironneau and Poujade. There is an idea of what we call the global administrative law. It's more a legal theory than a legal body. It's been developed in different areas and different institutes. It's also applicable to resources management. We distinguish this global administrative law from international law because it also involves individuals and other states. Well, this idea of global administrative law puts much emphasis on how law is being produced, how it's being applied, and not necessarily on its content. So because François Sironneau has just proposed some indication on how, what substantive principles should be taken into account. This concept, because it is more on how, it doesn't really matter, or less matters what's in the law, but what is more important how the kind of interest you have just evoked that there are at least 3 categories of consumers, and they may have, in the case of water scarcity, conflicting interests. So the question is how shall we those interests manage? So the 3 principles that global administrative lawyers propose, they say, and this principle you have to mention, the principle of participation, they add also transparency and the right to review. So if you disagree with a decision, you have a place where to go. I disagree with this plan, this management plan, whatever. There's a court, there's an institution where I go and I can make my claim. I don't know if you would agree that this idea, this method of thinking about lawmaking and global applicability would be also a good idea for Abu Dhabi maybe.
How can you transport our situation, for example, our French situation? We are constrained by European law. We have to obey to our principle, general principle, that's to say equality. Difference of situations of the Council of State has a jurisprudence about equity. What is possible? How can you manage to treat in a different way people? We have an example. It's not in the water. The situation when you pay a toll when you are going on a bridge. We have the famous le pont de l'île de Ré, for example. Who must pay? People, inhabitants of the island, people just on the continent, but at 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, so on. So we have to respect a lot of principles, and we are in a juridical context very, very different, of course. We respect international agreements, European law, our national principle, the separation of the field of the law, the field of regulatory orders. So how can we impose our, of course, there is obviously there is a difference of method and of imagination of the solution. The transposition, like I said, for my own, it's not really possible, of course, because the framework is really different, of course.
But just to complete, we proposed, yes, some principles to substantive principle, but those principles, whatever, are quite universal. The principle
participation in Abu Dhabi, it's not the same that public inquiries in France and so on. Okay.
But the more you use waters, the more you have to be controlled, and so it means at the same time you foresee principles such as equality or something like that. You have to enforce a very clear permit system, which would be dedicated to the main users. You don't ask for a permit for household uses, but for big farms, industrialists, and so on. And so, yes, and at the same time you enforce an administrative system, you support this system with incentives to help people, to help the user who are under a permit to respect the standards of this permit with loans, grants, and so on.
And it's easier to use policy techniques, maybe, in our country and in Abu Dhabi. Delivering permits, it's the traditional way of administration.
Yes.
Not binding and not binding techniques. So what we call in French, privilège du préalable, les techniques de l'administration unilatérale action, it's easier to use it in Abu Dhabi and like in France, maybe.
Yes, we have a question, please.
Ask the question at your neighbor. We have an example of the International Court of Justice, but and what about the European Union? The question is for you.
In case,
yeah. Il faut des traités. S'il n'y a pas de traité, on apprend la sortie. Oui, oui, absolument. Slovaquie, Hongrie, absolument.
Yes.
Argentine, Uruguay.
At the end of this session, I want to thank you all and thanks my all speakers here. Really, the time passed very fast. Thank you. Thank you.
So to conclude this session, we have Maître Yvan Razafin-Ratandra from the physics law firm, who's going to give us a presentation on contracting for sustainability in water.
Thank you. So I have the great pleasure to try to make a synthesis of all the different speeches that have been presented to you this afternoon. So I was really wondering if this mission was possible indeed, and trying very hard, I finally found that there may be different threads that can link the different speeches that you have heard this afternoon. The first the first thread is obviously law. Probably you have find that this was evident, self-evident, because it was in the title of the session. But if you look at it more closely, what kind of law are we speaking of? Most of the speakers were aware of public law, not about private law, but about public law. So it means that we have to deal with how public law or administrative law should evolve in order to be adapted to the question of better management of water resources and water usage. That's the first point. The second point is what is law? It is not only a tool, as you have seen. Law, especially on this topic of water management, is the result of political choices, and some of the speakers have, especially Mr. Schwedo, have underlined philosophical questions that have to be looked at when you speak of water law. So it's not just a question of management, it's a question of fundamental choices. And if you have this in mind, then you can step to the second point, which is obvious. These choices are not universal. There is no universal model that could be applied from, for example, from France and to be applied here. We can only identify the choices to be made, but the answers have to be elaborated in a specific circumstances, taking into consideration specific circumstances and cultures and institutions of each country. This is very important in terms of methods. The third point is management. This question is a huge question because you have probably noticed that most of the speakers agree on the point, from Jacques Sironneau to Mr. Poujade, that or Christine Maugüé, that there should be some form of integrated management framework of water resources. I must say that I don't agree with this principle, or I only agree on certain conditions. Why? Because management, it's such a strange word that comes from the company's field. So how can we use this word, this concept of management, and apply it without any transformation to such a thing, such a huge thing like water resources? Water resources, as many speakers have underlined, need to be defined and need to receive legal status. And these legal status cannot be taken from the private institutions or private law. It has to be taken in all its dimensions. Some of its dimensions is that it can be, or it could be to a certain extent, taken as a product or a good, but this is not sufficient. obviously, it has also to be taken, there's also other dimensions of water resources that have to be taken into consideration that go farther than just the notion of product. So it follows from that the notion of management, I'm sorry to say, doesn't apply to water resources. Or I would be more, it would be easier for me to say that if we choose to speak of management, then we should at least say that the relation between population and water resources are not only on one way, but a two-way dimension. It means that water cannot be just appropriated by man, either individual or collective. Water in itself, I would say, is managing. It's the water resources that are managing human lives and human development. It's just you can just take an example. There is no urban there is no town or that can be, or urban space that can be seriously developed without water. So the choice, you take Paris. Paris wouldn't even exist without the Seine. That was the original choice to set up this town at this particular place, and this condition was vital for the whole story of how Paris developed further. So you have to take into consideration the fact that water manages the development of human life. So there's a two-way dimension of the relation between man and. On that condition, I would agree with the notion of integrated management of water resources, but only on that condition, meaning that we have to do away with the wrong notion that man manages water. It's not only this dimension. And the third thread is method. So I will be very short on that topic because time is limited. But obviously, the different speakers showed that water resources and water usage can only be correctly managed with multi-layered instruments, with a multitude of instruments that have to be used at the same time and appropriately. Some of these instruments are legal, some of these instruments are just institutional coordination between the different corps, the different public bodies. Some of these instruments are economical, obviously, and some are economic, some are just instruments of control, even very refined instruments like geographical control from using satellites. But all these different instruments have to be applied at the same time, which means that it's not something easy to do, and which requires a very important capacity of coordination. Okay, I will just take a few minutes to speak about the contracts and the environmental dimension of contracts, which is an illustration of the different topics that I've just touched right now. The idea is that contracts are transformed by environmental considerations. Something that has not been said is that water is just a part of the environment. So elaborating on the idea of integrated management of water, we should probably the next time also elaborate on the idea that this integrated management should apply not only to water, but also to other parts of the environment. Just an example is polluted soils. Polluted soils are not at the outset a part of water problems, but they can become a part of this problem if they're not dealt with. And that's all the question of the protection of groundwater resources, for example. And air quality can also have consequences of the quality of water if it is not correctly dealt with. Water contracts, just a few words. We have observed that what I will probably wrongly term water contracts have been heavily transformed by environmental considerations. For example, we came from the idea that water was just a product that had to be produced, transported, distributed, and delivered, to the idea that this water has another dimension with it, which is obviously a natural dimension. So, taking this into consideration, the internal law has decided that that was the European Court of Justice on the 17th December 2000, Concordia. Oh, no. Yes. Decided that environmental criteria can be taken into consideration in the assessment of the best offer presented by candidates. So that's another illustration of what I just said. There's a dual dimension in the relation between man and water. It means that man will deliver, in order to deliver water as a product, has to take into consideration the necessity to protect the resource. You can find also in the Code of Public Procurement contains several dispositions making reference to environmental criteria in order, for example, to define the scope of needs or the conditions of application of contracts, provided they are linked to the object of the contract. You can find other dispositions in the Code of Consumers, which means that environmental law is not embedded only in the Code of Environment or in the law of water. It can be found in several different codes, even in the Code of Consumers. Unfair clauses are subjected to annulation by the judge. For example, the administrative judge in 2013 has annulled as unfair and abusive a general clause imposing 100% tariff increase in a case where the provider in a case where the provider was not given access to the device to measure up the volumes of water consumed. It was considered as abusive and unfair and annulled by the administrative judge, this type of clause. And on the international level, you can find, like Christine Maugüé has noticed, soft law as opposed to harder or more classic international law. Soft law, one example is international standards like ISO 26000. This is considered as soft law that can be applied by companies to environmental and social responsibilities. The UN General Assembly of now, the problem with international law as it is now is that there's a contradiction between law that is devised to protect environment and human rights, and on the one hand, and the other bodies of international law that are devised to protect foreign investors. And until now, like the decisions that have been taken by arbitrators under the aegis of the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. For example, in the case of Suez, Suez, Sociedad General de Aguas de Barcelona S.A. and Vivendi Universal versus Argentine Republic. In this case, the interests of the interests of the investors have been clearly better. They have received better protection than the human rights of the users of water services. And another case illustrates also the current state of international law on this topic. It's another decision of the 3rd of July 2002, Compañía de Aguas de Aconquija and Vivendi Universal versus Argentine Republic also. 110% increase of tariffs with degradation of the quality of service provided was not seen by the arbitral tribunal as sufficient to entitle the state to break the contract. So it means that beyond our discussion about water law, there's another, in the current state of things, there's another question that obviously has to be raised, is how each state, when it has to resort to foreign investors to build or manage infrastructures in the water sector, how can they keep control on this very sensitive sector in order to defend the interests of the population? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvan. Thank you for those who succeed to stay so late in the last day of the week. I really enjoyed this working session, and I'm very motivated to go on. And there are two topics I already would like us to work on, and you give us the good tracks. I would like us to work on the security dimension of water policies. I think this is something that we could look at for next session in June. And the other topic, which seems to be very clear, Yvan, is to work on this international investment and the protection of human rights and environmental protection. And I think this is something that we should work in maybe for the end of this year with the idea of organizing something around contracting. And the foreign investment seems to be a very, very relevant topic to work on here in Abu Dhabi, in this region of the world. Thank you very much for your attendance and all the best.